It says here that I'm going to speak about the life and work of Harry Bridges. Did you bring your sleeping bags? You have engines big and burnished, taller than my father's ken. All we have are men, master. All we have are men. Men solidly organized was all Harry Bridges needed. He was fortunate to realize his vision with the utilization of this power. He created power where none existed before. And during the Depression, he gave hope to workers and brought despair to employers. He brought about a social change in many ways that I'll talk about. During the Depression, there were no cushions for the down and out. No Social Security, no welfare, no disability insurance. All those things came later. I want to talk about the nature of longshore power. It has the power to stop goods of the transport of raw materials to manufacturing plants and the movement of the finished product to market, which of course affects profit. It's an awesome power that is not matched by teachers or janitors. It's the ability to place a bottleneck on the movement of goods and the realization of profits. When you get the ILWU, the East Coast longshoremen, the ILA, the Gulf Coast people, and the Teamsters, especially the long-haul Teamsters, you get a coalition of enormous power. And once when Harry and Jimmy Hoffa and Teddy Gleason of the longshore unions on the East Coast got together and talked about the possibility of putting together a coalition of that nature. There were something like 20 bills, pieces of legislation introduced into the House to prevent that sort of thing. After 1934, Harry became the target for the government and the employers to jail or deport him as a dangerous communist. The FBI said it had or could get evidence that would enable this great event to take place. Congress passed a bill of attainder specifically aimed at deporting our friend Harry. The bill of attainder said that he should be deported whether he was guilty of anything or not. Unfortunately, didn't pass the Senate. FBI surveillance was stepped up. They recruited witnesses who were willing to perjure themselves. And Harry was credited with bringing full employment to the ranks of the FBI. I just want to tell you a few anecdotes that will give you an inkling of the kind of personality Harry was. He was born in 1901 in Melbourne, Australia, during the height of British imperialism. He was a first son, there was another one, and 3 girls. His father was English, his mother was Irish, so he grew up in conflict. When he was a wee tad, his mother sent him to the post office to mail letters to Dublin. She said, you can buy only the penny stamp. So he would buy a big stack of penny stamps. He would paste them across the top, down the side, turn the envelope over, and paste the stamps across the back. One day he came home and he said, Mama, can't I buy a shilling stamp? And she said, never. The shilling stamp has a picture of the King of England, and no son of mine is going to lick the other side. He was an altar boy. He hated collecting rents, especially from his classmates. He turned his back on the middle class life because he started reading Jack London's books, and he loved the idea of going to sea. His father, hoping to discourage him, told a friend of his, a sea captain, to really work the pants off this young man so he would change his mind. But he never did. And he would sign aboard any ship that went wherever he had never been. So he went to Bombay, places like Macau, and he observed the class and color inequities in those places. He realized that the people would work all their lives and not improve their lot. The education available to their children was minimal, and so the hope for their children was limited too. He came to San Francisco in 1922. He never jumped ship, by the way, because if he had, they could have deported him without much trouble. He rose to leadership in 1934. They'd been organizing for 10 years before that. So they called it the Committee of 500. There must have been 15 people who did the work. And they would churn out mimeograph sheets talking about what was going on the waterfront. Harry would go see a sheet in the hand of a longshore person and say, oh, what's that? And pretend that it was news of the story that he'd written himself. They distributed the waterfront worker, as the sheet was called, up and down the coast because there were all these ships that plied the Pacific coast. And that way they got all the information to the people in the small ports along on the Pacific. He became president of the ILWU in 1936 and stood for office every 2 years. He retired in 1975 and he died in 1990. And between times he organized. He was always organizing. When he went down to New Orleans on a ship and was stranded on the beach, he walked to Burwood, Mississippi, where men were working, building the levees. They'd lash saplings together and then they'd drag it to where they wanted it and then throw rocks on it until it sunk. And he persuaded the workers to strike. They did. And so he was run out of town. He walked through the bayous to a shrimp fishing village, and in 1921 he organized it. It was a company town where the people would work all their lives. They wouldn't even own their boats. In 1938, when the CIO was meeting in St. Louis, a person from that shrimp fishing village came and asked for a charter. That was 1938. So he bragged that when he organized the place, it stayed organized, because there had been no contact between the CIO and that village. In 1981, he was selected to throw out the first baseball of the season at Candlestick Park, Giants. Well, guess what happened? They went on strike. They never did have an opening ceremony, and Harry was very disappointed. During the 34 strike, the five and dime store, the Woolworth heiress named Barbara Hutton, had gotten married, and she was on her way to Hawaii for her honeymoon. And she got to San Francisco, couldn't go any further. So Harry wrote her a letter, and he said, "Geez, I'm sorry I gummed up your honeymoon. Would you like to contribute to the strike fund?" And she did. She sent him $100. It was his philosophy that the worst they can say is no. He got wind of the fact that because he wasn't accepting any bribes and couldn't be co-opted, that the employers group had decided to get him killed. So the strike committee talked about it, and they agreed that if anything happened to him or any of the other officers, that they would not stop to ask questions. They would kill one of the other side, only they didn't know who. Well, that stopped the employers from going forward with their plan. In the organization of the ILWU, there was a 15% recall provision, and he was very proud of that. If you didn't like the way he looked or how he conducted himself, if you could get 15% of the membership to sign a petition for his recall, he would have to stand for recall. The other thing he did was he looked up the history of the longshore workers and found that a 1919 strike had been broken by scabs, and that most of them had been imported from the South, and they were black. So he spent a lot of time during the 34 strike visiting the black churches and pleading with them to join them on the picket line with the promise that when the strike was over, the membership rolls would be open and that the blacks could join as full members. He kept his promise. And for 34, that's quite a big step forward in terms of race relations. He contributed in bringing about creeping socialism. In 1936, he worked to see that Social Security became a fact in our lives. Then he went on to work for the placement of unemployment insurance in our state and, I guess, state governments. Later, disability insurance. Because he read so much, he believed in his right, or his rights under the Constitution, things like free speech. In 1936, when we were shipping scrap iron to Japan, he picketed or arranged for the pickets to stop those shipments from going on. And Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State, sent him a wire saying, stop interfering in the State Department's business. When Bill Moyers interviewed him, he said, well, weren't you interfering? And Harry said, certainly, that's our right, that's our duty. Moyers had expected him to hang his head in shame, but he didn't do that.